In 1564, if you wanted to know what Africa looked like, this was your best bet. This map sits at a fascinating historical crossroads, when geographic myths from antiquity finally began to collide with first-hand accounts arriving in Europe from Portuguese explorers. Created by the eminent Italian cartographer Giacomo Gastaldi, the map is crammed with a wealth of information, including small details like the pyramids of Giza just outside Cairo, the locations of wells along Saharan trade routes, and literally hundreds of mountains that may or may not actually exist. To buy the genuine map today, you'll need deep pockets. One of only 20 known copies is currently on sale for an astonishing $275,000. So what makes this map so special? And which hidden detail caught the eye of Marvel comic book writers centuries later? Let's take a closer look. Gastaldi's map was more than just an outline of the continent's geography. It was also highly strategic. The Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias had become the first European navigator to round the southern tip of Africa in 1488, and European powers were slowly expanding their influence, looking for commercial opportunities in these distant lands. Gastaldi notes several of these discoveries where potential profits could be found. For example, highlighting where you could find elephants for the ivory trade, saffron, and that Madagascar had forests of red sandalwood, highly valued for producing luxury textile dyes back in Europe. Top of the list, though, was gold. Gastaldi highlights one specific region of Africa where gold could be found or mined in abundance. This is the former empire of Great Zimbabwe, which once controlled these gold-rich highlands and the trade routes leading down to the coastal ports like Sofala. Its capital, Great Zimbabwe, flourished sometime between 1200 and 1500, and is depicted on the map as the twin cities of Zimbro and Zimbabwe. Today, all that is left of this city built by the ancestors of the Shona people are impressive stone ruins. In fact, it is the largest stone structure found in pre-colonial southern Africa. Gastaldi's sources were likely Portuguese, such as Vicente Pigado, captain of the Portuguese garrison of Sofala in Mozambique, who in 1531 described the region thus: "Among the gold mines of the inland plains, there is a fortress built of stones of marvellous size, and there appears to be no more to join in them." But the living powerhouse of Gastaldi's day, who continued to control the gold supply of this region, was the successor state, the Monomotapa Empire. In fact, right over the port of Sofala, Gastaldi leaves the label Sofala, which belongs to the king of Monomotapa. The Nile is probably the most famous river in the world, and it has featured on nearly all maps of Africa since antiquity. Yet where this great river actually begins has been debated by geographers for over 2 millennia. Gastaldi's map, at first glance, features a mistake typical of its time: 2 large lakes south of the equator feeding this great river. But to understand this confusion, we first have to go back to ancient Greece. Herodotus was one of the first to speculate on the Nile's source in the 5th century BCE. He dismissed the notion that the Nile could be fed by interior snowmelt, arguing instead that the deep African climate was far too hot to sustain snow. Instead, he speculated that the sun's pull, or the lack of it when it migrated north, was the main factor controlling its annual summer flooding. Some centuries later, Claudius Ptolemy popularized a more plausible theory based on actual witness testimony. In his Geograpia, published around 150 CE, Ptolemy described the travels of a Greek merchant named Diogenes, who had ended up seeking safe harbor in the lost city of Rapta, somewhere along the East African coast. From Rapta, Diogenes trekked inland, at which point he reported seeing 2 massive lakes fed by snowmelt, from what he said the locals called the Mountains of the Moon. According to Diogenes, this was the ultimate origin of the Nile. This theory went viral, and it would feature on Arabic and European maps of the continent for the next 1500 years. Perhaps skeptical of this ancient story, and relying more on contemporary Portuguese sources like João de Barros, Gastaldi does not explicitly identify the Mountains of the Moon. Instead, Gastaldi alters this model and emphasizes a great central lake called Zaire Zimbere, from which not only the Nile is sourced, but also other major African rivers like the Congo, Zambezi, and Limpopo. Gastaldi does not entirely dismiss the ancient traditions, though, keeping a second eastern lake which he calls Zaflam. The true source of the White Nile was only first realized by Europeans in 1858, when John Hanning Speke reached Lake Victoria and surmised its significance. There is one detail on Gastaldi's map that stands out because it doesn't belong to the real world, a reference to the priest Ioanni, better known to history as Prester John. But who was he? For centuries, Europeans were fixated on the idea of a powerful Christian monarch hiding somewhere beyond the Islamic world. This supposed descendant of one of the three magi became a regular feature on maps, and his reputation was so widespread that even Shakespeare referenced him in his comedy Much Ado About Nothing around the year 1599. Initially, medieval Europeans believed his kingdom lay in the east, potentially in India or Central Asia. This belief was fueled by a fake letter that appeared in Europe around 1165, purportedly written by Prester John himself to the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, boasting of unimaginable riches and power. As geographic knowledge expanded, explorers failed to find a Christian kingdom in Asia. The idea that Prester John's kingdom could be in Africa emerged in the 14th century, once Europeans began to learn about the real Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, headed by its imperial King of Kings. Monarchs in Europe were eager to locate this potential ally. In fact, when Bartolomé Dias first rounded Africa, he was explicitly charged by King John II of Portugal with finding the kingdom of Prester John. Gastaldi's full label reads, "Here in the Amara mountain, the priest Ioanni holds his children with great guard." Nearby we see this exact mountain, with 3 houses near its summit, and what looks like doorways or caves at its base. While Prester John was a legend, this label actually has some basis in reality. For centuries, it was the real practice of Ethiopian emperors to isolate male members of the royal family, specifically the potential claimants to the throne, on high, inaccessible mountain plateaus. The most famous of these mountain fortresses was Ambergeshen. By keeping the emperor's close family under constant guard on top of the mountain, the ruling monarch effectively neutralized the threat of internal coups. The written account of a Portuguese embassy to Ethiopia in the 1520s, recorded by the priest Francisco Alvarez, was the first European text to mention Ambergeshen, and it almost certainly inspired Gastaldi's map. Prester John never existed, of course, but for Gastaldi and other mapmakers of the 1500s, the map had to reflect the worldview of the wealthy people buying it. Abraham Ortelius even created a map in 1573 focused entirely on this imaginary empire, mirroring Gastaldi by placing the Amara Mons right on the equator. And if you haven't guessed already, Prester John is our hidden crossover with the Marvel universe, mostly appearing as a villain, trading blows with Thor, Deadpool, and the Fantastic Four. I'll include a link to his character profile down below. While tracing the source of the Nile was a massive challenge for European cartographers, correctly charting Africa's third longest waterway became an absolute nightmare. For centuries, the Niger River, or Niger to some, appeared on European maps flowing entirely the wrong way, west instead of east, and Gastaldi's influential map was partly to blame. That the Niger River confused so many cartographers is not surprising. Its physical course from the Guinea highlands forms a highly unintuitive horseshoe shape. Compounding the confusion is the fact that the Senegal River, located right next door, does flow west to the Atlantic coast. Ancient Roman writers like Pliny the Elder knew of a major river in West Africa, and many speculated that it connected to the Nile. Ptolemy too had described a river Nigris as an independent system losing itself inland, which later maps like Sebastian Munster's 1540 edition interpreted as flowing east. But when the Portuguese first entered the mouth of the Senegal River in 1445, Europeans assumed they had found a western branch of the Nile. Martin Waldseemüller's Carta Marina of 1516 labelled the Senegal River using a Portuguese source as such. This river irrigates all of interior Ethiopia when it floods and makes it fertile, just as the Nile irrigates Egypt, whence it is thought that this river is a part or branch of the Nile. Note Waldseemüller also depicts Ptolemy's Nigris River farther to the north of the Senegal. Gastaldi, however, dramatically redefined the geography of West Africa by physically connecting the Niger and Senegal rivers into one giant system near Timbuktu. Gastaldi retained some of the ancient Greek observations, for example, that it sourced from Lake Niger, now placed to the east. The partial passage of water underground to Borno Lacus, probably Lake Chad, also leans on ancient Greek theories for how great rivers seemingly traverse the arid parts of the continent. Abraham Ortelius copied this mistake in the first modern atlas, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, in 1570, and so the backwards flowing river became a fixture on European maps for the coming centuries. It wasn't until Guillaume Dellal's maps in the early 1700s that mapmakers finally rejected Gastaldi's model. Here we see that Dellal finally separated the Senegal from the Niger. and restored the river's true eastward flow. The bizarre shape of the Niger that caused all this confusion actually has a deep geological explanation. Modern geologists believe that the Niger was once two separate rivers. Over millions of years, upstream erosion from the lower river effectively captured the upper river, joining them into a single continuous horseshoe waterway. Europeans wouldn't fully unravel this mystery until the 1830s, following a series of perilous expeditions into the heart of West Africa by explorers such as Mungo Park and the Lander brothers, who tracked the river downstream to its mouth. For the people living along its banks, though, the river's flow was never a mystery. The Songhai Empire, which at its peak in the 16th century covered much of the river's course, almost certainly understood its flow south to the coastal wetlands now known as the Niger Delta. It's easy to get lost in the beauty of this 8-sheet masterpiece. It's a work of incredible detail that went on to influence other great cartographers like Gerardus Mercator, Abraham Ortelius, and Gerard de Jode. Map-making itself was also undergoing a technological revolution, and Gastaldi was one of the very first to ditch traditional woodcuts in favour of copperplate engraving. Engraving on copper allowed for vastly higher levels of detail, crisper lines, and microscopic text. The result was a masterpiece so prestigious it was dedicated to Maximilian II, the newly proclaimed king of the Holy Roman Empire. So that was a journey over probably the most important and influential maps of Africa from the 16th century. As always, I've included links to high-resolution scans of the original maps featured, as well as some further reading. If you've enjoyed the video, please do give a like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.